I am Elena and I am 30 years old. I came to the mountains because I told everyone I needed quiet. That was the easy version. The version I gave my mother over the phone was that work had hollowed me out and I needed a week somewhere with pine trees, cold air, and bad cell service. The version I gave my best friend was gentler, prettier, something about wanting to hear my own thoughts again. The version I gave myself changed depending on the hour. Sometimes it sounded noble, sometimes desperate, sometimes embarrassingly small. The truest version was this. I had started to feel like my life was happening in rooms with no windows. Not literally. My apartment had windows. My office had windows. The train I rode every morning had long smudged panes that showed me pieces of the city sliding by. But everything inside me felt sealed, airless, like I had been living too long in a place where my own voice bounced back at me, thinner every time, until I could no longer tell if it belonged to me. So I booked a cabin in the mountains 3 states away, the kind of place with a wood-burning stove and a cast-iron tub in the listing photos, and drove north with 2 sweaters, a paperback I'd already read twice, and a suitcase I packed as if I were preparing to be someone else by the time I came back. It was late October, and the road climbed in long slow curves through forests that looked like they had just caught fire and decided not to tell anyone. Gold, rust, burnt orange, dark green pressed underneath it all. I drove with the windows cracked despite the cold because I wanted the air to slap me awake. Every mile higher up, the world seemed to shed a layer of noise. Billboards disappeared. Gas stations grew sparse. Houses thinned out until there were only occasional mailboxes leaning beside gravel turnoffs, each one looking like it guarded a private life no one else knew how to enter. By the time I reached the town nearest the cabin, dusk had started pouring itself between the mountains. It was barely a town, really. One grocery store. One diner with a flickering neon sign. A gas station that also sold bait, postcards, and jars of local honey. The main street was lined with old brick buildings that looked sturdier than they needed to be, as if they had been built for winters meaner than the one waiting ahead. I stopped at the grocery store for coffee, eggs, bread, soup, and a bottle of wine I knew I wouldn't open on the first night, though I bought it for that exact reason. The cashier was a teenage boy with a tired face and a flannel shirt too big for him. He rang me up without looking at me much, then glanced at the address on the paper map I had printed out in case my phone lost signal. "You're staying at Black Pine Ridge." I looked up. "That obvious." He gave one small shrug. "Not many people this time of year." He put the eggs carefully into a paper bag. "Road gets rough after the split. Stay left at the old water tower, even if your GPS tells you otherwise." "Thanks." He hesitated for half a second, like he was deciding whether to say more. Then, "If it snows tonight, don't drive after dark." I almost smiled. "Is that local hospitality or a warning?" "For here," he said, handing me the bag. "Same thing." Outside, the air had sharpened. The sky was deepening into that blue that almost hurts to look at, and the mountains beyond the rooftops had gone purple, their ridges stacked one behind the other like folded paper. I stood beside my car for a moment longer than necessary, listening. There are kinds of silence in the world that are not really silence at all. This one held wind in the trees, the low hum of a truck somewhere in the distance, the metallic rattle of a sign shifting on loose screws. But beneath all of it was something I had not heard in months, maybe years. I followed the road out of town, then up a narrower one, then up a narrower one still. The last stretch was gravel and shadow. My headlights swept over trunks of pine and birch, over steep drop-offs hidden just beyond the shoulder, over drifts of dead leaves gathered at the edges like old secrets. At the split, I saw the water tower exactly where the boy had said it would be. A dark shape above the trees, skeletal and watching. I took the left fork. By then it was almost dark enough that the world existed only where my headlights touched it. And then the cabin appeared. Not suddenly, exactly. More like it had been waiting just outside the edges of visibility and decided to let itself be seen. A warm square of light glowed through the front windows. The cabin sat on a rise overlooking a wide slope of forest, with the mountains lifting behind it in immense black forms. It looked smaller than it had in the photos. Older too. More real. The porch steps sagged a little in the middle. The roof was steep and dark. Smoke drifted faintly from the chimney, which startled me until I remembered reading that the owner sometimes lit the fire before guests arrived when the weather turned cold. I parked and sat there with both hands still on the steering wheel. For one irrational second I thought, go home. Not because I disliked it. Because it was too exactly what I had asked for. There is a special kind of fear in being given the thing you said you needed. Because then there are no more delays, no more excuses, no more noise to hide behind. Just you and the shape of your own wanting standing in clean air. I got out of the car before I could talk myself into leaving. The porch boards creaked under my boots. The key was in a lockbox shaped like a fake rock beside the door, just as promised. Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar smoke, old wood, and that faint mineral scent old houses keep in their walls. The entry opened into one main room with a small kitchen on one side, a stone fireplace on the other, and windows facing west toward the descending dark. A wool blanket was folded over the back of the couch. There were stacks of board games on a shelf, mugs hanging from iron hooks, and a handwritten welcome note on the table in slanted blue ink. Elena, glad you made it before the weather turned. Firewood is stacked out back. Extra blankets in the bedroom chest. If the power goes out, lanterns are under the sink. The mountains are beautiful this week. Hope they're kind to you. Mara. I read the last sentence twice. Hope they're kind to you. Not enjoy your stay. Not let me know if you need anything. Something about the phrasing touched a place in me I had been trying not to feel. As if kindness, lately, had become a condition I approached like bad weather. Possible, but not to be counted on. I set my groceries down and moved through the rooms slowly, as if introducing myself to them. The bedroom was small and colder than the main room, with a quilt-covered bed and a narrow window above it. The bathroom had the promised tub, old and deep, its claw feet painted black. The kitchen drawers stuck a little when opened. The plates didn't match. One of the windows had a crack in the corner that had been mended with clear epoxy. I loved it immediately, which made me suspicious of my own tenderness. Outside, full night settled over the mountain. Made soup. I unpacked without really unpacking, leaving my clothes half folded on the chair as if I were still deciding whether I belonged there. I sat by the fire with my bowl warming my hands and listened to the wood crack open in bright, brief sighs. My phone had 1 bar of service, then none. I turned it face down on the coffee table and watched the flames until the room softened around them. That was when I noticed the notebook. It was tucked between 2 guidebooks on the shelf near the fireplace. Plain black cover. No label. Not new but not old either. Its corners slightly worn, a few pages bowed as if from damp fingers. I don't know why I reached for it. Maybe because it looked out of place among the tourist maps and birdwatching pamphlets. Maybe because I had always believed objects left in quiet places were rarely accidental. The first page was blank. The second page had one line written in neat handwriting. Tell the truth here, even if you do it slowly. I stood very still. Could have been a guest journal. The kind people leave notes in after vacations. Beautiful sunrise on Tuesday, saw a deer by the creek, coffee maker leaks a little. But this didn't feel like that. I turned another page. More handwriting. Different pens. Different slants. I came here after my divorce because I could not bear the sound of my own kitchen. Another page. I thought if I got high enough I would finally be able to see where I went wrong. Another. No one tells you that grief is embarrassing. Makes you dull at parties. My pulse gave a strange, quiet thud. I sank slowly onto the rug in front of the fire and kept reading. There were no names. Just fragments. Confessions. Some only a sentence, some a page long. They didn't seem arranged in any order. Different people, different years maybe. A man who admitted he had spent 6 months pretending to his children that he was fine because he believed sadness in a father felt like a structural weakness. A woman who wrote that she had fallen out of love so gradually she had mistaken it for adulthood. Someone who confessed to checking an old lover's social media every Sunday night, as if pain could be scheduled and therefore controlled. The writing was intimate in a way that almost felt illicit. Not dramatic, not polished, human in the rawest, quietest way. People telling the truth where they believed no one could punish them for it. My soup went cold beside me. There are moments when loneliness changes shape. Until then, mine had felt like absence, a missing chair at a table, a light off in a window. But reading those pages, I felt it become something else. A corridor. A strange, narrow passage between strangers who had suffered privately and still left evidence that they had been there. I don't know how long I sat on the floor turning pages. Outside, wind moved through the trees in long, low sweeps. Once, something brushed the porch. Just branches, probably. Though in a city apartment I would have called it weather. And here it sounded almost like an arrival. The fire settled deeper into orange. The room grew close and warm around me. Then I found an entry written in a careful hand that made me stop. I keep waiting for some grand betrayal to justify how unhappy I am. I read it again. Below it, in the same hand. But nothing dramatic happened. He did not cheat. He did not hit me. He did not leave. He was kind in all the ways people can point to from the outside. We just kept handing each other the wrong versions of ourselves until one day I realized I had not been honest in years. Not with him, not with myself. I am ashamed of how much damage can be done by politeness. Closed the notebook. Not because I wanted to. Because it felt like someone had reached through the page and touched the bruise directly. My relationship had not ended in some cinematic ruin. No slammed doors. No betrayal with a clean narrative. Nathan and I had been together for 4 years, and when it ended 3 months ago, the only thing that made it feel like a breakup was the silence afterward. Before that, we had simply become two people performing good, with increasing skill and decreasing soul. He was a decent man. That sentence had trapped me for longer than I liked to admit. He remembered my coffee order. He called when he said he would. He brought soup when I was sick and introduced me to everyone in his life as though he was proud of me. If you laid out the facts of him on a table, most women I knew would have told me not to be stupid. But love is not a courtroom, and unhappiness does not need witnesses to be real. For the last year we were together, I had begun speaking in edited versions. Softer opinions. Smaller needs, fewer inconvenient truths. Nothing anyone could point to as tragic. Just 1,000 tiny acts of self-erasure committed in a calm voice over dinner. I told myself this was maturity, compromise, partnership. I told myself that wanting something unnamed and unproven was selfish. The body keeps better records than the mind does. Mine had started warning me first. Tight chest on Sunday nights before seeing him. Relief when he cancelled plans. Followed immediately by guilt. A feeling impossible to dress up, that every time he kissed me goodbye I was being gently pressed deeper into a life that fit from the outside and suffocated from within. When I finally ended it, Nathan looked more confused than hurt. "I don't understand," he said, sitting on the edge of my couch with both hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone white. "I thought we were okay." And I, already crying, said the truest thing I knew. "That's the problem. I can't do okay anymore." I had expected freedom to feel brighter than it did. Instead it felt like standing barefoot on a cold floor. There was relief, yes. But relief is not the same thing as peace. After the breakup came a season of second-guessing so relentless it felt like a second job. I missed him sometimes. Or maybe I missed the structure of being known by someone, even imperfectly. Friends congratulated me in hushed tones, as if I had escaped something they couldn't quite identify. My mother asked too many times whether I was sure. I said yes every time, and each yes cost me something. Then work got busier. Winter turned to spring, spring to summer, summer to the first hard edge of fall. Life rearranged itself around the missing piece. Kept moving. But I did not feel free. I felt untethered. Which, depending on the day, looked almost identical. I opened the notebook again. The firelight moved over the ink. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint tick of cooling pipes somewhere in the walls. Near the back of the notebook, I found several blank pages. On the inside cover, tucked into a pocket, there was a pen. Course there was. I laughed then, softly and without humor, the sound surprising me in the small room. It seemed absurd that strangers had come here and left pieces of themselves like offerings, and that now the notebook waited with patient certainty, as if it had known I would eventually arrive at this exact moment. Sitting cross-legged on the floor in wool socks, with cold soup nearby and a history I had not named out loud in months. Picked up the pen. Then put it back down. There are truths that resist first drafts. Instead I stood, carried my bowl to the sink, and opened the curtains over the front windows. The darkness outside startled me. Not because it was total but because it wasn't. Once my eyes adjusted, the mountain revealed itself in layers. Black treetops shifting under the wind, pale stones at the edge of the path, the thin silver seam of a creek lower down the slope. Above it all, the sky had cleared. Stars covered it in impossible numbers, sharp and white and indifferent. City stars apologize for themselves. These did not. I rested my forehead against the cold glass. For a long time I stayed like that. When you live in a city, you can almost believe that your pain is the loudest thing in the world. Buildings echo it back to you. Sirens weave around it. Light pollution creates a dome over your life that makes everything feel immediate and central. But under a mountain sky, the scale changes brutally. You are reminded that sorrow is ancient, ordinary, and very small. This should have made me feel diminished. Instead, it made me breathe. I don't know when I first sensed I wasn't entirely alone. Maybe it was the feeling before the evidence, the way animals know weather is coming. Maybe it was just instinct sharpened by unfamiliar darkness. But some part of me registered a presence before my eyes found it. There at the edge of the trees beyond the porch. Figure. Froze. It stood half in shadow, still enough that for one panic second I thought it might be a trick of branches and moonlight. Then it moved. Just a shift of weight, a step forward into the pale wash coming from the cabin windows. Person. Broad-shouldered. Wearing a dark jacket. Too far away to see clearly. Close enough that I could tell he was looking at the cabin. Me. Every sound in my body seemed to vanish at once. My thoughts scattered, then narrowed into one bright instinct. Lock the door. I stepped back from the window so fast my heel caught the rug. The pen rolled off the notebook and onto the floor. My breath had turned shallow, ridiculous. I told myself there were 100 harmless explanations. Property manager. Neighbor. Hiker lost after dark. But the human body is embarrassingly bad at logic when fear gets there first. I crossed the room, checked the lock though I'd already locked it, then reached for my phone before remembering I had no service. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel it in my throat. When I looked back toward the window, the figure was gone. Not walking away. Not approaching. I stood in the middle of the room, listening with every part of myself. The fire popped. Wind pressed briefly against the side of the cabin. Somewhere outside, leaves skittered over wood. I waited for footsteps on the porch, for a knock, for the unmistakable shift of a doorknob under someone else's hand. Nothing. After a full minute, maybe two, I forced myself to move toward the window again. Slowly this time, staying to the side. I looked out. Path. Trees. Dark. I stayed there long enough for cold from the glass to reach my skin. Maybe I imagined him. Maybe not. Either answer made me uneasy. On the table by the door, under the welcome note, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A folded sheet of paper weighted beneath a small river stone. My name was written on the outside in the same blue ink as Mara's note. I crossed the room and unfolded it. Forgot to mention, if you see the neighboring cabin's owner around, don't be alarmed. He keeps odd hours and checks the trail sometimes before storms. Keeps mostly to himself, but he's harmless. Name's Jonah. I stared at the page. Then I looked toward the window again, where the dark pressed softly against the glass like a held breath. Harmless. I didn't know why that word made my pulse climb all over again. I folded the note back along its crease, more carefully than I needed to, and set it down. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound almost like whispering. The mountains, I thought suddenly, were not going to let me ease into this. And for the first time since arriving, some feeling beneath the fear stirred awake. Not comfort. Not calm. Something older. Quieter. More dangerous. Attention. I did not sleep easily that first night. I told myself it was the drive, the altitude, the unfamiliar sounds of a house settling in cold weather. I told myself it was normal to lie awake in a new place and hear danger in every harmless noise. A branch against the roof became a hand. The sigh of wind under the eaves became a footstep circling the porch. Once, just after midnight, something thudded softly outside the bedroom wall, and I sat bolt upright in bed, every muscle pulled tight, staring into the dark until I realized it was probably nothing more sinister than snow slipping from a branch. Probably. The cabin held darkness differently than the city did. In my apartment, even with the curtains drawn, there was always some diluted glow leaking in from streetlights, from neighboring windows, from the sleepless machinery of other people's lives. Here, once I turned off the lamps, the room became almost total. The kind of dark that makes you aware of your own breathing as if it belongs to someone else. So I left the bedside lamp on. Not bright. Just enough to make the quilt visible, enough to outline the dresser, the chair in the corner, my half-open suitcase. I felt faintly childish for it, but not childish enough to switch it off. I lay there with Mara's note on the nightstand and the stranger's name repeating in my mind. Una. A harmless man who keeps odd hours. There was something irritating about how little that actually narrowed down. At some point, sometime deep into the night, I must have drifted off. I woke to thin gray light and a silence so complete it felt deliberate. For one disoriented second, I didn't know where I was. Then the smell of old wood, the sloped ceiling, the mountain air seeping through the window frame returned all at once. I sat up and saw snow. Not much. A light covering. Just enough to soften the ground and settle along the porch railing and the dark arms of the pine trees. The whole world outside looked quieter for it, as if the mountain had placed a finger gently over its own mouth. The fear from the night before had not vanished exactly, but daylight had changed its proportions. What had felt like a looming threat now seemed vague, almost embarrassing. A stranger at the tree line. A note explaining him. A cabin in the woods doing what cabins in the woods do, magnifying every shadow until it acquires a pulse. Still, when I got out of bed, I checked the front window before I did anything else. Nothing. Just the pale morning, the path half covered in snow, and the slope dropping away into the trees. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen counter drinking the first cup with both hands around the mug. It was one of those thick ceramic mugs that hold heat longer than expected, chipped lightly at the rim. Outside, the sky was low and white, the mountains barely visible behind the weather. I watched steam rise in front of the window and tried not to think about how quickly a person could disappear into a landscape like this. There is a kind of relief that comes with morning after fear. You wake half expecting your dread to be waiting for you in full shape, and instead you find only its coat hanging on the chair. Me. Manageable. Almost foolish. By the time I pulled on boots and my heaviest sweater, I had nearly convinced myself I had overreacted. The snow squeaked faintly under my steps when I walked out onto the porch. The air was so cold it felt clean enough to cut. I stood there for a moment, wrapped in it, letting the cold sting my face awake. Then I saw the footprints. They came from the tree line, not straight to the cabin. Angled. Passing along the side of the porch, around toward the back, then disappearing beyond the stacked firewood. One set only. Boots, probably a man's from the depth and width, though I was hardly an expert. The snow had filled some of them in, softening the edges, which meant they were old enough to belong to last night and recent enough not to have disappeared. I stared at them longer than necessary. Then I followed them. Not because it was wise. Because curiosity has always been one of the less respectable engines of my life. At the back of the cabin, near the woodshed, the prints paused. You could see it clearly in the snow. A slight disruption, the deeper impression of someone standing still. Just beyond that, beside the stacked logs, was a split piece of birch placed neatly on top of the pile. And tucked beneath it, protected from the snow, was a pair of work gloves. I frowned, bent down and touched them. Dry. Heavy. Men's gloves, lined with flannel, worn at the palms. Left there deliberately. Not forgotten. On top of the gloves was a note torn from what looked like the corner of a paper bag. Storm knocks branches loose. Don't park too close to the west side tonight. No signature. I looked up instinctively, scanning the woods, the ridge, the neighboring slope. Nothing moved except the trees. Somewhere farther down, invisible through the pines, water ran over rock in a muffled, steady rush. I should have gone back inside immediately. Should have set the gloves on the porch, locked the door. Told myself it was a practical gesture from a neighbor who preferred distance to introductions. Instead I stood there, holding a stranger's note in my bare hand, and felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with fear. Attention again. Not the sharp, survival kind from the night before. Something more focused, more human. He had circled the cabin in the dark to leave a warning about where to park. That was either considerate or unhinged, and the difficulty was that in remote places those things sometimes wear the same coat. I carried the gloves inside and set them on the table. The note I placed beside Mara's, the two pieces of paper looking oddly domestic there, like the beginnings of correspondence. Then I laughed at myself for even thinking that. The rest of the morning I tried to behave like the kind of woman who comes to the mountains for solitude and not for mystery. Showered. Made eggs. I opened my book and read the same paragraph 6 times without absorbing a word. Every few minutes, my eyes drifted to the gloves on the table. Around noon, the clouds lifted enough to reveal the ridge beyond the valley, all dark stone and white breath. I decided I needed air, motion, proof that I had not come here to become one of those women in Gothic novels who spends her days staring out windows waiting for unnamed things. On the hook by the door hung a trail map laminated in plastic. A red circle marked the cabin. A blue path led down to a creek overlook and looped back up through the trees. Easy hike, 90 minutes. I took the map, my coat, and the kind of determination that usually means trouble. The trail began behind the cabin, narrow and half hidden under snow and old pine needles. At first it dipped gently through the trees, the ground springy beneath my boots. The air smelled like sap, wet bark, and the mineral hush of coming weather. Occasionally the wind moved through the branches overhead and sent a shimmer of snow dusting down. Should have been peaceful. It was peaceful. And yet I walked as if I expected the woods to answer a question I had not fully asked. Maybe that was why I noticed small things I otherwise would have missed. A fresh saw mark on a fallen limb near the path, too clean to be old. A section of trail recently cleared of brush. A weathered wooden post with a carved arrow that looked handmade rather than store-bought. Signs of maintenance. Of someone tending this place quietly, without announcement. Jonah, I thought, and immediately disliked how easily the name had begun to inhabit the landscape. The overlook sat on a rocky shelf above the creek, where the land opened enough to show the valley below. I stood there with my hands shoved deep into my pockets and felt the wind move straight through my coat. The water below was silver and restless, breaking itself over stone in white seams. Across the valley, layers of mountain rose one behind the other into cloud. I should tell you something true. I have always mistaken distance for clarity. Whenever my life becomes unbearable at close range, some part of me starts fantasizing about altitude, highways, airport gates, train stations, hotel windows, horizon lines. As if moving far enough away from myself might finally turn me into someone legible. As if pain seen from a mountain ridge becomes wisdom. Doesn't. Not automatically. Mostly it just becomes pain with a better view. I stood there long enough for my cheeks to go numb. Then I heard it. Crack. Not loud but distinct. Wood under pressure. Came from somewhere uphill and to my left. I turned too quickly, boots slipping slightly on the rock. Another crack, followed by a rush of sound through branches. I barely had time to register motion before a limb, long, dead, heavy with wet snow, broke free from a tree above the trail and crashed down across the path I had taken in. Needles flew. Snow burst upward in a white spray. The impact echoed through the trees with a force that hit my chest. I stumbled backward, heart slamming, one hand out as if I could physically stop what had already fallen. For a second, the whole mountain seemed to hold still around the aftermath. Then a voice behind me said, calm and low, "You should step away from the edge." I turned so fast I almost lost my footing again. He stood several yards back from me on the trail. Tall exactly as I had thought. Dark jacket, faded thermal shirt beneath it, heavy boots dusted with snow, a wool cap pulled low. He looked to be somewhere in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, though there was something about mountain weather on a face that makes age harder to place. Not handsome in the polished way magazines teach you to notice. Something quieter, roughened around the edges. Dark beard, a mouth that looked more used to withholding than smiling, and eyes the color of wet bark. Steady, unreadable, fixed on me with careful restraint. In his right hand he held a small handsaw. I stared at it, then at him, then back at the saw. He followed my gaze and let out what might have been the beginning of a sigh. That's fair. I hated that my voice trembled only a little. You've been around my cabin. Yes. No apology. No awkwardness. Just truth. He nodded toward the fallen limb. And that's why. For one absurd second I wanted to laugh. Instead I said, "You could have introduced yourself like a normal person." A flicker crossed his face. Not offense. Recognition, maybe. As if he had already considered that and rejected it for reasons known only to him. I'm not great at normal person timing. The answer irritated me because it was either disarming honesty or practiced charm, and I did not yet know which. You left gloves behind my cabin. I did. And a note. Yes. You watched the cabin last night. That made him pause. Not long. Just enough to tell me I had landed near the truth. I checked the trail before storms, he said. Your lights were on. I saw you at the window. Didn't want to knock that late. There are people whose silence feels evasive, and people whose silence feels selected, like they have learned words cost more than most others realize. He belonged to the second kind. Every sentence seemed measured against some internal rule. I folded my arms tighter across my chest, partly for warmth, partly because I did not trust the openness of my own body. Mara could have mentioned you before I arrived. She usually does. She forgot. His mouth shifted, not quite a smile. That sounds like Mara. The wind moved between us, sharp and cold. Somewhere above, snow slid softly from a branch. He looked past me to the overlook's edge again. You really should step back. I became suddenly aware of how near the rock dropped away beneath its covering of snow and ice. My pride and survival instinct argued for half a beat. Then survival won. I took 2 steps toward the trail. Thank you, he said, and crouched beside the fallen limb. It was obvious in one glance that he knew exactly what he was doing. He examined where the branch had split, set the saw, and began cutting smaller sections with efficient, practiced movements. No wasted energy. No performance. Just work. I should have left then. That would have been the sensible thing. Nod, retreat. Preserve the clean outline of stranger danger that had kept me cautious. Instead I heard myself ask, do you just spend your time wandering around rescuing tourists from trees? He kept sawing. Only the ones who ignore weather. I was on a mock trail. Still weather. I watched him for a moment, irritated again by the ease with which he made me sound naive. Then I said, you might be the least reassuring harmless person I've ever met. That did it. This time he actually smiled. It changed his whole face, though not in the way smiles do on men who use them carelessly. It appeared slowly, like something unfamiliar returning. Brief. Crooked. Gone almost as soon as I had registered it. Probably, he said. And there it was again. That dangerous stir of attention, low and unwelcome and alive. I looked away first. Down the trail, snow clung to the pines in soft white bands. My pulse was still too fast from the falling branch, from the proximity, from the fact that fear and curiosity had started tangling together in ways I did not entirely trust. He cut through the last of the limb and dragged the pieces clear of the path. When he stood, he wiped his gloves against his jeans and glanced at me as if making a decision. Storm's supposed to come in heavier by tonight, he said. If your generator kicks off, there's a breaker box behind the woodpile. Sticks in the cold. I held his gaze this time. Do you leave emergency notes for everyone, or am I special? Beat past. His expression did not change much, but something in it sharpened. Not flirtation exactly, not softness, but awareness. First option's safer, he said. Then he picked up the saw and stepped aside, leaving the trail open. I should tell you I was immune to that kind of line. I was not. Not because it was smooth. Because it wasn't. Because it sounded like the truest thing he could allow himself to say. For a second neither of us moved. Snow whispered from somewhere high in the branches. The creek below kept speaking in its endless low rush over stone. Then I nodded once, turned, and started back toward the cabin. I could feel him behind me without looking. Not following too close. Just there on the trail, a weight in the silence. The first bend I glanced back. He had stopped where the overlook began. One hand resting lightly on the saw, body turned half toward the trees, half toward me. Watching to make sure I made it past the slick section, I realized. When he saw me notice, He lifted his chin once in acknowledgement. No smile this time. Kept walking. By the time the cabin came into view through the trees, my cheeks were cold, my boots were wet at the edges, and something inside me had become profoundly inconvenient. Because now Jonah was no longer a figure at the tree line. He had a voice. And that, I was beginning to understand, was much worse. The storm arrived earlier than expected. By late afternoon, the sky had lowered itself into a heavy, colorless ceiling that pressed down on the mountains until even the far ridges disappeared completely. The air thickened. Sound dulled. It felt less like weather moving in and more like something closing. I stood at the window with my second cup of coffee and watched the first real snowfall begin. Not delicate. Not decorative. The flakes came fast and dense, slanting sideways under the wind, filling the space between the trees until depth itself became difficult to measure. Within minutes, the trail behind the cabin blurred into white. The footprints from the morning disappeared as if they had never existed. It was a strange kind of erasure. Clean. Immediate. Unapologetic. I thought about the notebook. About all the people who had come here and written truths they hadn't been able to carry anywhere else. About how easily even those could vanish if left in the wrong place at the wrong time. A damp cabin. Leak. Fire. One careless moment. And all that quiet honesty would dissolve into nothing. There is something terrifying about how fragile truth is when it finally surfaces. I moved away from the window and sat on the rug again, the notebook open in front of me. For a while I just held the pen. Not writing. Just feeling the weight of it between my fingers, as if the act itself required a kind of permission I hadn't yet granted myself. Tell the truth here, even if you do it slowly. The sentence had begun to echo. I flipped back through a few of the entries I had read the night before. The same lines landed differently now, as if something in me had shifted just enough to hear them more clearly. I thought if I got high enough, I would finally be able to see where I went wrong. No one tells you that grief is embarrassing. I am ashamed of how much damage can be done by politeness. Closed my eyes. There is a moment before honesty where the body resists, not loudly, but in small, subtle ways. A tightening in the chest. A sudden urge to stand up, to check your phone, to reorganize something meaningless. As if distraction might save you from the responsibility of naming what you already know. I felt all of that. And then, because I had come all this way and because something about the mountain made avoidance feel smaller than it had in the city, I opened my eyes and began to write. I am afraid that I don't know how to love without disappearing. The words looked too sharp on the page. Too definitive. Too revealing. Instead, slowly I continued. I have spent years becoming easy to keep. Not because anyone asked me to. Because I thought that was the price of being chosen. The pen moved faster then. Not rushed but steady. Like something that had been waiting for the right conditions and had finally found them. I learned how to adjust my tone. My timing. My needs. I learned how to sense when I was too much and fold myself down before anyone had to tell me. Called it kindness. Called it compromise. I called it being a good partner. But I think it was fear. The wind rose outside, pressing briefly against the walls. Snow tapped against the window in uneven bursts. The cabin creaked softly, the old wood responding to the shift in temperature. Kept writing. Not fear of being hurt. Fear of being left. The sentence landed deeper than I expected. I paused there, my throat tightening in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Nathan's face surfaced in my mind. Not the version from the breakup, confused and pale, but earlier. Softer. Smiling across a table. Standing in my kitchen, sleeves rolled, stirring something in a pot like he belonged there. The version of him I had loved without question. He didn't ask me to disappear, I wrote. I offered it. That was the hardest part to admit. Because it meant the story wasn't clean. There was no villain to point to. No betrayal to simplify the narrative. Just two people, one of whom had slowly made herself smaller in the name of love, and the other who had accepted that version without realizing what it cost. Or maybe he had realized. Maybe that was part of it too. I exhaled slowly and leaned back, my hand cramping slightly from writing. Outside, the storm intensified. The world beyond the window had become almost entirely white now, the trees reduced to dark vertical lines barely visible through the snowfall. It felt like being suspended in something without edges. I glanced at the table. The gloves were still there. For a moment I considered returning them. Walking down the trail, finding Jonah's cabin, if there even was one, and handing them back with some casual excuse. But the storm had already made that impossible. And if I was honest, that wasn't the real reason I stayed. The real reason was quieter, less practical. I didn't trust myself yet to stand in front of him without revealing more than I intended. There are people who make you aware of your own edges. Not because they push against them. 'Cause they notice them. And Jonah, in the short span of time I had known him, had the unsettling quality of someone who paid attention without asking permission. It wasn't invasive. It was worse. It was precise. The power flickered just after dusk. Once. Then it steadied. I looked up from the notebook, my body already reacting before my mind caught up. The lights dimmed slightly, then returned to full brightness. The hum of electricity in the walls resumed. Waited. Nothing. Still, I stood and moved toward the back of the cabin, toward the woodpile where he had said the breaker box was. The snow had deepened enough that stepping outside required effort now. It came nearly to my ankles, soft and resistant. The air was sharper, the wind more insistent. It tugged at my coat, pushed strands of hair across my face, filled my ears with a constant low rush. Behind the cabin, everything looked slightly altered. The familiar shapes softened, edges blurred, distances shortened. I found the breaker box exactly where he had said it would be. And just above it, nailed into the wood of the cabin wall, was a small metal hook I hadn't noticed before. Something about that unsettled me. Not in a frightening way. In a deliberate way. Like a place meant for something that was currently missing. I stood there longer than necessary, the cold beginning to creep through my boots. Then I heard it. Sound through the storm. Not loud. Not close. But distinct enough to separate itself from the wind. A rhythm. A step. I turned slowly, scanning the white blur of the trees. First I saw nothing. Then a shape emerged between the trunks, moving with steady, unhurried certainty through the snowfall. Una. He wasn't looking at me at first. His head was slightly bowed against the wind, one hand holding the edge of his jacket closed, the other carrying something I couldn't make out. His movements were economical, familiar with the terrain in a way that made the storm seem less like an obstacle and more like an inconvenience. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he looked up. Our eyes met through the falling snow. For a second, neither of us spoke. The world had narrowed to the space between us. The white air, the sound of wind, the quiet awareness of two people standing in a place that did not belong to either of them entirely. Then he gestured toward the breaker box behind me. Power flickered. Yes, probably the line catching ice. He stepped closer, his boots leaving deep impressions in the snow that would disappear within minutes. You good? He nodded. It came back. He studied me for a moment. Not obviously. Not in a way that could be called intrusive. But I felt it anyway. That careful, measured attention again. You shouldn't stay out long, he said. Temperatures dropping fast. I noticed. Snow gathered on the shoulders of his jacket, on the edge of his cap, along the line of his beard. Up close, I could see that his eyes weren't just brown. They held flecks of something lighter, almost amber, catching what little light filtered through the storm. He lifted the object in his hand. Lantern. Old-fashioned. Metal frame. Glass panels slightly fogged from use. Just in case, he said, holding it out toward me. If the power goes. I looked at it, then at him. You always come this prepared, or is this part of your unusual hospitality? There it was again, that almost smile, brief and restrained. Depends on the situation. And this is what kind of situation? He considered that. Then simply. One where you might need light. The answer was so direct it disarmed me more than anything clever would have. I reached out and took the lantern. Our fingers didn't quite touch, but they came close enough that I felt the proximity of warmth through the cold air. It was ridiculous the way my body registered that. Ridiculous and immediate. "Thank you," I said, quieter now. He nodded once. Neither of us moved. The storm filled the silence between us, thick and constant. Snow collected at our feet, on our shoulders, in the small spaces where heat from our bodies briefly resisted it. I became aware of how isolated we were. Not in the dramatic cinematic sense. In the simple, undeniable fact that there were no other sounds of people anywhere nearby. No distant cars. No voices. No evidence of life beyond the two of us standing in the white. "You live close?" I asked before I could reconsider. "Close enough." "That's not an answer. It's the one I'm giving." I exhaled, half annoyed, half aware that pushing him would only make him retreat further. "Do you always talk like that?" "Like what?" "Like every word is being rationed." A flicker of something passed through his expression again. Not irritation. Something closer to recognition. "Only when it matters." The wind shifted, stronger now, pushing snow sideways between us. Instinctively, I stepped slightly closer to the cabin wall for shelter. He noticed. Of course he did. "You should go inside," he said. "You keep saying that. And you keep not doing it." I opened my mouth to respond, then stopped. Because there was no clever reply that didn't feel like avoidance. The truth was simpler. "I don't think I came here to stay comfortable." The words surprised me as much as they did him. For a moment he didn't speak. He just looked at me. Not at my face exactly. At something just beneath it. And in that quiet, snow-filled space, I had the strange, disorienting feeling that he understood more of what I meant than I had actually said. "That's not the same as staying safe," he said finally. "No," I agreed. "It's not." Another pause. Longer this time. The kind that stretches just enough to become something you have to decide whether to hold or break. Then he stepped back. Just slightly. Enough to restore distance. "Lantern's full," he said. "Lasts most of the night." And just like that, the moment shifted. Practical again. Contained. "Good to know." He nodded once more, then turned toward the trees. I watched him take a few steps. His figure already beginning to dissolve into the snowfall. "Jonah." He stopped. Didn't turn immediately. Then slowly he looked back. "What?" he said. I hesitated. There were 100 things I could have asked. "Where exactly do you live? Why do you watch the cabin? Why do you feel like someone I should be careful around, but not in the way I expected?" Instead I said the smallest thing. "Why do you stay out here?" Long pause. The storm moved between us, softening the edges of everything. When he finally answered, his voice was quieter. "Because it's harder to lie up here." Then he turned and walked into the trees. And this time when he disappeared, it didn't feel like fear. It felt like something had just begun. The power went out just after midnight. Not dramatically. No loud snap, no violent shift. Just a quiet, almost polite withdrawal. The lamp flickered once, twice. And then the cabin slipped into darkness so complete it felt like a presence. For a second I didn't move. It was strange how quickly the body remembers fear. Even after a full day of light, of movement, of convincing myself that everything here had explanation and structure, the dark returned me instantly to that first night. To the awareness of walls, of distance, of the fragile boundary between inside and outside. Then I reached for the lantern. It sat on the table exactly where I had left it, metal cool under my fingers. When I lit it, the flame bloomed slowly, filling the glass with warm amber light that pushed the dark back just enough to make the room visible again. Not bright, just intimate. The kind of light that doesn't erase shadows, only softens them. I carried it to the fireplace, added another log, and sat on the floor with the notebook in my lap. The storm outside had deepened into something steady and insistent. Wind moved through the trees in long, continuous breaths. Snow tapped against the windows in irregular rhythms, like something trying gently, persistently to be let in. I opened to where I had left off. The words I had written earlier looked different now in the lantern light. Less stark, more honest. Or maybe I was just less inclined to argue with them. I read them again slowly. I am afraid that I don't know how to love without disappearing. The sentence no longer felt like an accusation. Felt like a question. And questions, I realized, are easier to sit with in the dark. I turned the page and began writing again. I don't think anyone ever taught me how to stay. Not in the way that matters. I learned how to be chosen. How to be liked. How to be easy in the beginning. But no one showed me what it looks like to remain visible once someone decides you belong to them. The lantern flame shifted as I moved, shadows stretching and folding across the walls. The cabin seemed smaller now, but not in a suffocating way. More contained, like a space designed to hold something fragile. I thought love meant being understood without having to explain yourself. But maybe love is the opposite. Maybe it's explaining yourself over and over again, even when it feels inconvenient, even when it risks changing how someone sees you. Pause. Outside, the wind dropped suddenly, as if the mountain itself had taken a breath. In the quiet that followed, a new sound emerged. Soft, deliberate knock. Froze. Came again. Not loud. Not urgent. Just there. 3 measured taps against the door. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. Every muscle tightened. My breath stilled. The pen slipped slightly in my fingers. For a moment, I didn't move at all. Then I stood. Slowly. The lantern light swayed slightly as I lifted it, casting shifting patterns across the walls. I crossed the room with careful steps, my awareness narrowing to the door, the handle, the thin line where would met frame. The knock didn't come again. But the presence remained. I could feel it. On the other side. I stopped just short of the door. Who is it? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Was. Then, through the wood, slightly muted. Jonah. Course it was. Relief came first. Then something sharper. Not fear. Something closer to anticipation. I hesitated only a second before unlocking the door. When I opened it, the cold rushed in immediately, sharp and clean and overwhelming. Snow swirled in the air beyond the porch, catching the lantern light in fast-moving patterns. Jonah stood there, partially covered in snow, his jacket dusted white, his hair damp at the edges beneath his cap. He looked like he had been walking for a while. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he glanced past me into the cabin, his eyes adjusting to the lantern light. Power's out, he said, as if confirming something he already knew. Yes. You okay? Yes. Beep. You sure? I almost smiled. I'm holding a lantern and talking to you through a snowstorm at midnight, I said. I think, okay, is relative. That earned a quiet exhale from him. Almost a laugh, but not quite. Fair. The wind picked up again, pushing snow across the porch. He shifted slightly, bracing against it, and I became aware of the fact that he was still standing outside. You're going to freeze, I said. I won't. That wasn't a suggestion. Another pause. Then, carefully, as if stepping into something that required awareness, he crossed the threshold. I closed the door behind him, shutting out the storm. The cabin felt smaller immediately. Not claustrophobic. Just altered. The presence of another person changes space in ways that are hard to explain. Air shifts. The silence rearranges itself. Even the light seems to settle differently, as if adjusting to accommodate more than one set of thoughts. He stood near the door, not moving further in, as if waiting for some signal. I set the lantern on the table. You didn't come all the way out here just to check the power, I said. No. Then why? He took a moment before answering. Not because he didn't have one. 'Cause he was choosing it. Storms worse than they predicted, he said. If the lines stay down, you could be without heat by morning. I have the fireplace. Only works if you keep feeding it. I can manage that. I know. The way he said it made something in my chest shift. Not flattery. Not doubt. Recognition. He glanced toward the stack of firewood by the wall, then back at me. I brought more. Blinked. More. He nodded toward the door. Stacked it on the porch. I hadn't heard him, which meant he had done it before knocking. Quietly. Deliberately. Why? I asked before I could soften the question. Came out sharper than I intended. Not unkind. Just direct. He didn't seem surprised by it. Because you'd need it. That's not an answer. It is. No, I said, stepping a little closer. It's a reason. Not a why. Something flickered in his expression then. Not irritation. Not defensiveness. Something deeper. Like I had stepped closer to a boundary he was used to people respecting without question. The room held still around us. The fire cracked softly in the background. The lantern flame moved just enough to cast shifting light across his face, catching the lines of it in ways that made him look both older and more unguarded. I don't do well with unnecessary explanations, he said finally. And I don't do well with incomplete ones. Another pause. Longer this time. Then quietly. You were alone. The simplicity of it disarmed me more than anything else he could have said. Not you needed help. Not it was the right thing to do. You were alone. I felt that land somewhere I wasn't prepared for. And suddenly, the cabin didn't feel smaller anymore. Felt shared. I looked away first. Toward the notebook still open on the floor. Toward the words I had written that now seemed too visible, even though he hadn't read them. I came here to be alone, I said softer now. I know. Then why does it feel like you keep interrupting that? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. I'm not trying to interrupt it. Then what are you doing? Another pause. Making sure it doesn't become something else. I frowned slightly. Something else. Isolation, he said. The word settled heavily between us. I crossed my arms, more out of instinct than cold. There's a difference. Yes. How? He looked at me then. Really looked. Not at my face. At something beneath it again. The way it ends, he said. Silence followed. Not empty. Full. The kind that carries more weight than conversation. I became aware of the fire again. The way the light moved across the room. The steady presence of him near the door. The fact that neither of us had stepped further away. You don't talk like most people, I said. I know. That's not a compliment. I know. A small, involuntary smile pulled at my mouth. It surprised both of us. The tension shifted slightly. Not gone. Just different. Outside, the storm continued, relentless and distant now behind the walls. Inside, the space between us felt quieter. More precise. I glanced at the door. You should probably get back before it gets worse. I've walked in worse. I don't doubt that. Beep. Still. He nodded once. Then, as if remembering something, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small object. A folded piece of paper. He stepped forward just enough to place it on the table beside the lantern. For the generator, he said. In case the breaker sticks. I looked at it, then at him. You plan for everything, don't you? No. Just storms. Just what I can control. That sentence lingered. Because I knew exactly what it felt like to live the opposite way. He turned toward the door. Then, without looking back, he said. You don't have to finish everything you start writing tonight. Blinked. What? He glanced over his shoulder. Just briefly. Some truths take more than one night. My chest tightened slightly. You didn't read it. No. Then how do you? He didn't let me finish. I don't need to read it to know. And for the first time since I had met him, I didn't have a response. Because the unsettling part wasn't that he understood. It was that he didn't need proof to believe it. He opened the door. The storm rushed in again, cold and immediate. For a second he stood there, half inside, half out. Then he said, quieter now. Keep the lantern close. And stepped back into the snow. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. I stood there for a long time after he left, listening to the storm. watching the lantern light, feeling something inside me shift again. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to know that whatever this was, this place, this silence, this man, was no longer something I could observe from a safe distance. It had already begun to involve me. And the most unsettling part, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted it to stop. I woke before the storm ended. Not because of noise, if anything the world had gone quieter than before, but because something in me had shifted just enough to pull me out of sleep. For a moment I didn't move. The lantern had burned low sometime in the night, its light now faint and amber, barely holding the edges of the room together. The fire had settled into a bed of glowing coals. The air was colder, sharper, the kind of cold that lives in the spaces between objects. And underneath all of that, stillness, the kind that comes after something has already passed through. I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders, and listened. No wind pressing against the walls. No snow tapping at the glass. Just the quiet, steady presence of the mountain holding itself together again. I stood and crossed to the window. For a second I thought I had gone blind. Everything outside was white. Not the layered, textured white from the day before. This was something else. Smooth. Complete. The trees bent slightly under the weight of snow. Their dark lines softened into shapes that looked almost unreal. The path had disappeared entirely. The edge of the slope was gone, replaced by a seamless drop of pale light. The world had been rewritten overnight. Clean. And for a strange, disorienting moment, it felt like I had been rewritten with it. I pressed my palm lightly against the glass. Cold. Real. Still here. Behind me, the cabin held the quiet aftermath of a long night. The notebook lay open on the floor where I had left it. The pen rested across the page. The lantern flickered faintly, its flame nearing its end. I turned back toward it slowly. There is something about morning that makes truths feel different. At night, they rise out of shadow, heavy and unavoidable, shaped by silence and absence. But in the morning they remain, but softer. Not weaker. Just integrated. As if the body has had time to absorb them into something livable. I knelt beside the notebook. The words I had written the night before were still there. Unchanged. Waiting. I read them again. Not searching for flaws this time. Not questioning whether they were too much or too honest or too inconvenient. Just reading. I am afraid that I don't know how to love without disappearing. The fear was still true. But it no longer felt like a sentence. Felt like a beginning. Picked up the pen. And for a long moment I didn't write. Because something else had surfaced. Not a thought. A realization. Quiet. But undeniable. I had spent so much time trying to understand why things had ended with Nathan, what had been missing, what had gone wrong, what I could have done differently, that I had overlooked something simpler. I had left. Not because I failed. Because I finally told the truth. That mattered. More than I had allowed it to. I lowered the pen to the page. Maybe I didn't lose something. Maybe I stopped pretending I had it. The words came easier now. Not because they were lighter. Because I was no longer fighting them. And maybe that's not failure. Maybe that's the first honest thing I've done in a long time. I exhaled slowly, a tension I hadn't realized I was holding easing just slightly. Outside, the light shifted as the clouds began to thin. The white landscape brightened, subtle shadows forming where there had been none before. Closed the notebook. Not because I was finished. Because I wasn't. And for the first time that didn't feel like something I needed to fix immediately. I stood, stretched, and moved toward the kitchen. The cabin felt different this morning. Not emptier. Not fuller. Just settled. Like something inside it, and inside me, had aligned enough to let the space breathe properly. I made coffee. The simple act of it grounded me in a way I hadn't expected. The sound of water heating. The smell of grounds. The slow, steady process of something becoming what it was meant to be. When I stepped outside with the mug, the cold hit harder than before. Cleaner. Sharper. The sky had begun to open, pale blue breaking through the thinning clouds. Sunlight touched the tops of the trees first, turning the snow into something almost blinding where it caught. I stood on the porch, breathing it in. And then I saw him. At the edge of the clearing. Not hidden this time. Not watching from a distance. Just there. Jonah stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking out over the slope as if he had been there for a while. The snow reached higher on his boots now, the path to where he stood barely visible. I didn't feel fear this time. Or surprise. Just awareness. I stepped down from the porch, the snow deep and resistant beneath my feet, and walked toward him. He didn't turn immediately, but I knew he knew I was there. "You survived the storm," I said when I was close enough. He glanced at me then. Brief look. "Enough. You did too. Thanks to your excessive preparation." That's one way to call it. I took a sip of coffee, the warmth grounding against the cold air. "You check on all your neighbors like this?" "Yes." "You're not my neighbor." "Then what am I?" He considered that. Long enough to make the question feel heavier than I intended. "Temporary," he said finally. The word landed softly. Not unkind. Just accurate. I looked out over the valley. The snow stretched endlessly, untouched in places, marked only by wind and the faint lines of trees beneath it. "Most things are," I said. He didn't respond to that. But I felt the shift anyway. The kind that happens when two people recognize something true at the same time. We stood there in silence for a while. Not awkward. Not forced. Just shared. I became aware of how different this felt from the kind of silence I had known before. With Nathan, silence had often been something to fill. Gap. A pause waiting for words to make it meaningful again. Here it already was. "You were right," I said eventually. "About what?" "Isolation." He glanced at me. I continued before I could overthink it. "I thought I came here to be alone. But I think I came here because I didn't know the difference. And now," I exhaled slowly, "now I think I'm starting to." He nodded slightly. Not approving. Not questioning. Just acknowledging. I shifted my weight in the snow, the cold beginning to creep through my boots. "You said it's harder to lie up here," I said. "It is." "Why?" He looked out over the valley again. For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. "Because there's nothing here to echo it back to you." I frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "In the city," he said, "you can say something that isn't true and still feel like it fits. There's noise, movement, people. Everything blends together enough that you don't have to sit with it. And here." He glanced at me again. "Here it just stays." The simplicity of it settled into me. And I realized he was right. There was nowhere for anything to hide here. Not really. I looked down at the snow between us. The space. At the distance that wasn't quite distance anymore. "I wrote in the notebook," I said. "I figured." I didn't finish. "You're not supposed to." That made me smile. "Of course I'm not." Beep. Then quieter. "I think I've been trying to finish things too quickly." He didn't respond immediately. Some things don't need finishing." "Like what?" He held my gaze for a second, then looked away. "Like understanding everything at once." I let that sit, because it felt like something I needed to hear. Not just here. Everywhere. The sun broke through the clouds fully then, light spilling across the valley, catching the snow in a way that made everything shimmer. For a moment it was almost too bright to look at. I raised a hand slightly, shielding my eyes. When I lowered it I realized something. I wasn't thinking about leaving. Not yet. Not in the way I had been before. Counting days. Measuring time. Planning the return to a life that felt slightly misaligned. Instead I was just here. And that felt like enough. For now. "I'll bring your gloves back later," I said. "You can keep them." "I don't need them." "You might." I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. 'Cause I understood what he meant. Not about the gloves. About the possibility of needing something I hadn't anticipated. "Okay," I said. He nodded once. Then, after a moment, "Trail will be clear by this afternoon." That sounds like a hint. It is. I smiled slightly. About leaving. About choosing. The word stayed with me. Long after he said it. Long after we stood there in silence again. Long after the sun climbed higher and the snow began its slow, inevitable shift from untouched to changed. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? Not about the mountains. Not about him. About me. I hadn't come here to escape. I had come here to reach the point where I could finally decide what to keep, what to leave, and who I was willing to be when no one else was shaping the answer. I took one last sip of coffee, now lukewarm, and looked out over the valley again. Then, without thinking too much about it, I said, "I'm not done here yet." Jonah didn't ask what I meant. He just nodded, like he had already known. And for the first time in a long time, that didn't feel like something to question. Felt like something to trust.